final presentation is from Susan Saupe with Cook Inlet Regional Citizens Advisory Council, and she is presenting on a low-angle view, making sense of Cook Inlet's complex rock platform and reef habitats. And as background, Sue grew up on Kodiak Island, began working in NOAA ships as an undergraduate in chemistry over 30 years ago. Her UAF graduate work focused on Bering and Arctic marine food webs, followed by several years working in Woodsville, Massachusetts, studying carbon flow through East Coast estuaries. She returned to Alaska for the Exxon Valdez oil spill damage assessment studies, which led to her current position directing a multidisciplinary science program for Cook Inlet Regional Citizens Advisory Council focused on contaminants, nearshore habitats, and oceanography. Susan was lead scientist for Alaska's first environmental monitoring and assessment program surveys and initiated Shore Zone, a coastal habitat mapping program in Cook Inlet that has since developed into a statewide partnership and it actually goes all the way down the west coast. So thank you, Sue. Take it away.
So I'm going to talk about a kind of a unique habitat. It's unique to Kamishak Bay and Lower Cook Inlet, but it's ubiquitous in that area. So I'm going to talk about our challenges in kind of trying to develop a method that effectively assesses the habitats and the type of species that exist there. So I'm not going to go into the normal what is an RCAC because I think everybody here is familiar with it. But I want to talk a little bit because we are in a different area than the Prince William Sound RCAC, but our area of responsibility encompasses Cook Inlet, but our area of concern, of course, is much broader because of the ability for currents and prevailing currents to carry oil far beyond an event that took place in our area of responsibility. Our risks are a little bit different than what you face in Prince William Sound RCAC. You have much more tanker traffic than we do, but we have a lot of discharge of produced water, so hydrocarbon discharges into the inlet in these mixing zones. We have active production platforms, undersea pipelines crisscrossing the inlet. We have active exploration that takes place, and we also have shipping that does take place in the inlet. So when we look at our mandates from Oil Pollution Act of 1990, they're the same as the Prince William Sound RCAC. We developed our strategic plan around evaluating all the tasks that are outlined and developing programs that address them. So, for example, monitoring and potential environmental impacts of the operations of oil industry in Cook Inlet, study wind and water currents, and other environmental factors in the vicinity of terminals which might affect the ability to prevent, respond to, contain, and clean up an oil spill. And I want to focus on this one because this other environmental factors, those three words are what we build an entire coastal habitat mapping program on, because in our view, the type of habitats that you have on the shoreline are truly what's going to determine how you would approach cleaning up an oil spill if an oil spill was carried to the shorelines. So study wind and water currents, that's fairly straightforward. We built a physical oceanography program around that. And then our habitat mapping helps us identify highly sensitive areas which might require specific protection measures. And then we have a lot of other review and technical evaluation kind of responsibilities. So this is just an example. We try to cover, the whole inlet when we're doing our environmental monitoring studies, right in the area, right in mixing zones, right in the areas of concern where you have active oil industry operations, and then to cover the entire background. And that's just an example of one study that took place in 2008, 2009. But we know oil spills are a risk, and we know that the risk is carried far beyond where the oil spill actually took place. So when you had an oil spill in Prince William, it carried completely downstream into other sensitive areas and areas that are over 1,000 miles away. So in Upper Cook Inlet, if we were to have a spill, we know that it too could be carried by the prevailing currents like the Exxon Valdez oil spill was by the Alaska coastal current. by the prevailing currents in Cook Inlet to areas downstream. This is a schematic. We've learned that some of this is a little overly precise. It's not exactly what we believe happens year-round, but the prevailing currents down the west side are from north to south, and so we know that areas downstream of oil industry operations are directly in the path if there was to be an event in the upper inlet. We also know that different types of shorelines retain oil differently, have expected different potential impacts to it, and your ability to respond to or address the impacts vary depending on what kind of substrate you have and what kind of wave exposure, and they range from typically lower from exposed rock platforms to salt marshes that act kind of like a sponge. These are typically above mean high water, but if the oil were to get into those sponges, you can have, for example, in the East Coast near Woods Hole, there's one where they still see oil in there after 50 years. So these can act like a sponge and really maintain that oil. In Cook Inlet, we have very high tidal ranges, so a lot of this shoreline is intertidal and is exposed twice a day. And on the really minus tide, you have a lot of real estate that's exposed on a low tide. If an oil spill were to reach shore, it's going to reach shore in the intertidal somewhere between mean high water and mean low water. So that was a habitat that we really wanted to make sure we had a good handle on. And as you can see from this side, this is Terry Klinger from University of Washington, and I was with Mandy doing some work over there, and we went over there. Mandy got this great photo of her showing the amazing vertical zonation. But over on the west side of Cook Inlet, from a shore zone photo, you can see that there can be this incredible horizontal real estate, or hectares and hectares, that are exposed during the tide. So to try to get the best understanding of what is the range and what are the types of habitats we have in Cook Inlet, and I know you got a more detailed presentation about the coastal habitat mapping program in Alaska that we started in Cook Inlet, which is shore zone, and it had been applied in Washington and BC, but it was through our pilot project that made it a web accessible tool with the imagery as part of the deliverable to the public. But we flew all of Cook Inlet, and we did it actually twice. We did it initially in the pilot project, and then about 9 years later, we had some additional funding to do it with much higher resolution. And this is all available. If you don't remember from last year, it's flying along and collecting digital video and still imagery at low tide, so it's always zero tide or lower, low altitude, oblique angle, and it's all spatially referenced. So you get a georeferenced imagery and database, imagery and habitat data database. And so all of this data that from the imagery, you look at the imagery and then you try to hang and break the shoreline into units based on a digital shoreline. And this is kind of an important concept. So in this example, this is what your digital shoreline looks like. And a mapper would look at this imagery and say, okay, well, we want to make a separate unit right there to there. So that's that unit right there. And on that unit, you would map things like wave exposure, geomorphology, sediment texture, the biota, other things like man-made features or drift lines. This is a list of all of the different things, and some of them are modeled, some of them are calculated. But they're all mapped along shore and across shore, and these are examples of some of the biobands that we mapped. But if you look, for the most part, these biobands are mapped shoreline parallel, and they have very, very specific zonation patterns, and you'll see why that's important later. But as you know, you can access this now. We did a pilot project serving it on the web in the early 2000s, but it has been served for about the last 10 years on the NOAA website. You can access it also on the Alaska Ocean Observing System now through Cook Inlet Response Tool and other data portals throughout the state of Alaska. And it allows you to access this data and imagery online. So not surprised to most of you, there's a lot of mudflats in Cook Inlet. So we did find a lot of that habitat. And it's actually pretty difficult to do, the shoreline flights because these go so far offshore that if you're flying off here to capture all the all the mudflats, you miss, the detail that might be occurring in the foreshore. So there were some kind of unique challenges on how we would map that area. But one of the things that we found was that in Camashack Bay and the west side of Cook Inlet, there was a habitat that most people don't think of in Cook Inlet, which are these incredibly low-angle, flat platforms and rocky reef habitat that didn't really have a lot of information available to them in the historical data sets. And this is an example over on the west side, just west of Augustine Island. And this is actually one of the more narrow of these rocky reefs. But it shows you the unusual patterns in them. You can see that this, you're not seeing these, shoreline parallel biobands. They're almost perpendicular to the shoreline. And it's really extensive habitat. And it's some of these areas that you'll see in a map that they're about 5 kilometers by 20 kilometers of habitat, one reef system. So how do you go in and analyze that data? Well, in 2009, I had some funding to do helicopter work in Cook Inlet. That was the second time we flew the shore zone. But we had an extra day of helicopter time and 2 extra barrels of fuel on Augustine. So Mandy and I flew out to these reefs to try to do some preliminary assessments of what are some of these habitats that we're seeing. I mean, look at the extent of this intertidal that's exposed, just on a tide. And also to get a picture of the scale. When you're in the air, you're looking down at this. If you look at these 2 little areas there, you can see the scale. I mean, this bulge here is just this little spot there. And you can barely even detect, this. It's a little bit different time on the tide. But the extent of these, and it's kind of hard to get it to wrap your head around the scale of these reefs without going on shore. But we were also finding some unique things that we had these almost monocultures of seaweed that we hadn't identified anywhere else before. So it turns out that it's actually a fairly common seaweed in the Gulf of Alaska, but it's a completely different morphology, and it creates an incredibly extensive habitat for nearshore organisms. The other thing that we noticed is that there were other species that you saw almost monocultures instead of real diverse habitat, but they differed where you were when you went from sort of east to west within Camashack Bay and up the west side. So, I mean, you can see that this looks like almost just one species that goes on for a really long way. Lower tidal zone, you have some of the kelp showing up, but again, dominated by one species. But you can see changes as you kind of moved around into the inlet. And why we were interested in these is that, one, I told you that we do know that they're downstream of oil industry operations. But it's an area where herring spawn, so it can be an important nearshore herring spawn habitat, and there's not a lot of knowledge about what species and exactly what assemblages are the most important for the spawning events. And then there's other essential fish habitat, as you'll see, eelgrass that's kind of embedded within these rocky reef platforms. But the main driver for the study was this planned lease sale from Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and they put out a call for studies to fill data gaps in areas that could be potentially impacted from this. So I put in a study plan to look at these rocky reefs in more detail, and the Park Service put in a study to study benthic habitat in general on the west side, and we were asked to put in a joint proposal, and the funding is going through Park Service and then to RCAC, and then because we're doing subtitle work with the University of Alaska, with NOAA, with Mandy, and then, of course, Park Service. So this was there were some blocks that were bought during the lease sale, so this is an area that's potentially going to be impacted not only from the existing activities in the upper inlet, but from additional activities that could take place nearby. And we know, if you just look at the sediments, this is sediment loads that are coming in from the upper inlet rivers. It's carried down by those prevailing currents to the lower inlet, just like oil would be. And when we've done drifter work with Mark Johnson at the University of Alaska, it also shows the prevailing currents in the area. But the one thing, in order to do this work, is that I talked about the biobands, how we map on shorelines. So that data is kind of snapped to a line. So you have a digital shoreline, and typically your species occur in zonation patterns depending on what tidal height they prefer. And you know they have a fairly strict tidal zone that they prefer, and you map as a bioband. But if you go on shore, and we have a program that does these shore line transects, we go and realize, of course, that their species assemblages. They're not always just one species. But it's pretty straightforward. We run a transect line and we collect species data and we tie it to the biobands. But when you come to an area like this, you lose that shoreline parallel. You lose the very kind of specific zonation patterns. And you have these incredibly extensive habitats that don't change much. The vertical change with horizontal change is very low. So it's, you know, our standard techniques with low site levels is a lot more difficult. So we had to come up with new ways to do it. And we decided to approach it kind of like we did with salt marsh mapping. Again, with the shore zone data, it's great because it tells you where the salt marshes are, but it snaps it to a line. And so in order to understand salt marshes, this is Oil Bay, and this is a salt marsh in Oil Bay. We had to go in and do a lot more detailed work, and we didn't snap the data to the line. We actually mapped it as polygons. So we wanted to go in and do this for the intertidal area where you could maybe draw circles around and understand better the total area of these different species assemblages and try to model it for the larger Kachemak Bay and Lower Cook Inlet. So with this funding from BOM through the Park Service, we set out to assess rocky habitats in Lower Cook Inlet that are at risk to activities associated with the potential federal lease sale. Well, it is a reality now. Part of that was to compile historical reports and data of habitat in the area, conduct nearshore habitat assessments for that habitat, and give them recommendations for a future long-term monitoring program if they were to move forward with something longer term. So we did go in and research and mapped what had been done. And you can see that there's actually quite a lot of work that had been done, but a lot of it's focused just near the mouths of these areas, and a lot of times that's just due to weather and access, because you can get kind of behind something and you can always sample. So a lot of the more exposed stuff wasn't, and then here it was almost all soft sediment habitat. So these huge rocky reefs weren't addressed, and we wanted to distribute it a little bit more outside of these bays, although some of our sites did land within the bays. And so we selected sites based on a couple considerations. We wanted them to be representative of a range of the rocky habitats that occur, and then give the most complete geographic coverage of Western Cook Inlet within the constraints of the project. And we did constrain it, the first part of the project, between Tuxedni Bay and Channock Head, and we did the outer reefs as a separate. We only sampled during minus tides, and we used both vessel and helicopters to access our sites. So we used all of the habitat data that we had from Shore Zone and to select the type of categories that we wanted, and we used habitat classes 1 through 10 out of a range of over 30 habitat classes. So, and then a geoprocessing tool was applied to generally spatially balance the random points with the shoreline segments, and ended up with 6 sites that first year. And these are the 6 sites. These are shore zone photographs that show the extent of these reefs, and they ranged, like I said, from up just north of Chittenden Bay, up in near Tuxedni Bay, down to Channock Head. In the next couple years, we've added some sites within that area, like, for example, this is Nordyke Island, Broon Bay. This is another outer coast one south of Iliamna, and these are near Iliamna Bay, like Turtle Reef and Scott Island. So we realized that we really needed to have a good understanding of how these habitats and the species assemblages varied by really slight differences in tidal heights across these huge reefs. And so our normal level of measuring things with a site level, like I mentioned, is just not going to work in this kind of area. So we relied on a method called real-time kinematic GPS or GIS, and what we had was a base station that would sit for a minimum of 4 hours and collect and not budge and collect data from these satellites. And then we had the roving GPS units that would be in contact with the base station as well as the satellites. And then you could do the after corrections from the really high quality data that you got from the base camp to the rovers. But these allow you to not only get centimeter precision in the horizontal distance, but in the vertical distance. So it's really pretty powerful and incredible what we do. And so this is showing it in operation. Way up here is the base station. We ran our transect line down, and you can see the RTKs being collected. And I'll show that we then collected quadrats all along that study area. But when they did a grid, our transect was 10 meters wide, and they went a little bit outside and tried to get a really high-resolution grid. They went up and over every boulder, every bump. But we have an incredibly high precision map of the vertical structure of each of our sites. And then we did a lot of we did photo quadrats, and we also did point count quadrats along that. They were randomly placed, but we got we used the rover to collect the GPS data that would be corrected again. So we know the exact tidal height relative to the geoid of every quadrant, and we're going to be able to place them very precisely vertically as well as horizontally in those beaches. And again, I just showed this because Mandy's in here and Sam's in here. They both, Sam came out our first year, and Mandy's been out with us every year. This is Kathy Kuhn, our project director. But you can see just an example of how we have the base station, and we have the transect, and we have the rovers. So this is an example of what some sites look like and how we have random quadrats placed within it. So we're getting all the species that are occurring in these quadrats, as well as really detailed vertical structure in it. We also have a dive component with Dr. Katrina Aiken and Brenda Konar, University of Alaska. So off the end of all of our intertidal sites, they also did dive surveys. And I'm not going to talk about the data because I really wanted to talk more about the challenges of trying to design a study, and this is a multi-year study, so we'll be working on this data. But this is the kind of type of data that you might be able to look at and that we're starting to see is, looking at species and species diversity. We'll be able to make comparisons of that with sites from north to south. But we'll also be able to place the presence of each species within tidal heights by site and look if there's differences from north to site or regional differences. You can see that, for example, the axes go from north to south in each of these by site. But some species, this is Saccharina latissima, really is only occurring in the southern part of the study area, and some are more ubiquitous throughout the study area, but there are differences in the tidal heights that they occur on different sites. And some of the invertebrates, again, are more ubiquitous across the study site, and other species, well, this is another seaweed, are not, and occur more in the southern area. We'll be able to do community assemblages comparisons to look at what's driving the similarities between sites within sites, and this is called multiple dimensional scaling. It gives us an idea of how you can plot it different ways, but the only thing that this is telling you that categorically symbols that are closer are more similar in their species assemblages than ones that are further apart. And you can start looking and pulling out what's driving the placement of these relative to each other, whether it's by site, whether it's by elevation, and what species are driving it. We've even started to look at things by region instead of individual sites. We've also, a really important part of this project is to collect voucher collections because we don't have good vouchers from most of these study sites. And we make this part of a lot of our RCAC projects wherever we are, whether we're down the Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak, or Cook Inlet, and work real closely with Mandy and also with Dr. Sandra Lindstrom. And all of our samples, about a really high-resolution digital scanner, sent that down to Juneau and to Noah, and Mandy's been producing these high-resolution scans, so we have a record of every seaweed that we have, and we've noticed some unique morphologies and range extensions. And we will be providing these to herbarians at the University of British Columbia and the Smithsonian Institute. All of the data will eventually become online as part of our Shore Station database with the Shore Zone program, as well as on the AU's website. And we'll link the seaweed information to the Seaweeds of Alaska website that's been updated and kept current by Mandy and Sandra. These rocky reefs on the offshore are a special challenge, and we decided to approach these with helicopter because they include over 5 kilometers this direction and over 20 kilometers this direction. And in order on one tide to be able to do much, we needed to be able to hit a lot of these reef systems. Most of them are not connected to land, without a lot of water in between. So we had to be able to land, get out, and do some sampling and address it. So these were a special challenge. We did a pretty intense effort last summer out there on the reefs. We do have some information from, these are infrared photos, and you can see, this eelgrass here. This is terrestrial vegetation, as you can see. This is that loop in there, so that you can see. But you can't really tell the difference between this and some of the other vegetation that occurs other than knowledge about where these species occur. But without getting on the ground, being able to verify, this is an essential fish habitat, how extensive are these eelgrass beds in the region? So we wanted to get in on the ground and do it. But the exciting thing is just last year, the Park Service got some additional funding, and we added another component to this project. So there's the base station, there are the rovers. But doing the real-time kinematic GPS method on an airplane as well. And so we put in, with the Park Service, these ground stations that are big enough that they could be seen by the air, where very detailed GPS measurements were made while we were on the ground, and then they were marked. So when it flies over and captures that ground station location in one of its photographs, they know the precise location of that, and they can use that to calibrate the entire rest of it. But because they're also collecting the data from the satellites in the base station, we will also get very high detail vertical measurements. So what that's going to do is allow us to understand not just along our transect across a flat, but we'll be able to know the tidal variations along all of these habitats so that we can start to take our site-specific data and scale up and do some modeling of the whole area and the habitats in the area. And so this is the area that they plan to cover this summer. Last summer they did back and forth grids along here. They photographed nadir photographs, so they were directly down, and they had to have about over 50%, preferably 60 to 80% overlap with all their photos. This was their priority area because the Park Service is real concerned about razor clam habitat. So this is the first area that they've done the processing of the imagery. So I don't have anything to show you from there other than a photograph in a moment. But I just want to show you the level of detail that they're able to capture on the tidal height stuff. So this is one of those photographs. It doesn't look that much different than what you see when you fly over, when you're getting ready to land in Anchorage and they fly you over by Port McKenzie. You can see these mud flats and you can see channels crisscrossing them. But the data that they got back on the channels and the depth, these are actually to centimeters. They've been lumped into much bigger categories, 1 meter categories, but they are detailed to centimeters. But you can see every single little channel and everything. So if you can see this level of detail on these mud flats, we're going to get this level of detail on all of these huge reefs that we've been studying in Lower Kamishak. So we're really excited about that. And so, for example, if we have this high-level detail along our transect, we'll now have that level of vertical and horizontal structure along that whole coast. And so our data can then be used to model the bigger area. I just want to point out one other thing, the importance of doing this work in this aerial photography during low tide. This is a project that was recently done by NOAA, and unfortunately the Alaska NOAA team did not have a choice. They were limited by the availability of these airplanes and this equipment because it's used during hazards for like hurricanes and everything. So they couldn't do it at low tide. So they got this beautiful imagery. These are all our sites. But that site that I showed you, you don't see the reef at all. You don't see the reef. 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 Here you can see the reef underwater because it was a really clear day. So, for example, on this side, it just looks like muddy water offshore. This is probably the tide height that it was flown, but this is really what that habitat looks like. So being able to use imagery that's collected on the lowest of the tides to match up with the types of tides that we go out and study is really important to what we do. And so this is a multi-year project, and we are right here. So we have one more field season coming up this summer, and then we will have our final report in fall 2019. And then I just want to say that, you know, the one benefit, I've done a lot of oceanography work, and I've done a lot of nearshore work, and I really like the nearshore work because we work really hard when the tide's out. But when it's high tide, this is what we do. It's either data entry or this. This is this buoy that we found as marine debris. And so tied it off, and everybody jumped off and bounced around. This is our BOEM contracting representative. And then I had to include this. This is Sam, who just gave the previous talk, working really hard in between tides. So if you have any questions, you can contact me at Saupe@RCAC.org.
Thank you so much, Sue. Questions?